Like we did last week, I thought it was good last week. We talked about the Little Rock Nine, right? Did a little bit of history. Um, that was good. I mean, I told you this has been an experiment for me to do this 4 week crash course, um, which works if there's new people coming in every time, every 4 weeks, and people come in, they see my four classes, they go out, they go take the test. But that's not always how the distance learning project works, and that's fine. Um, so I thought, I don't know, I'll have to talk with Lisa Bailey and the other teachers and see how I want to do things after the new year. Um, and we'll let you know through email. But for today, we can do something different. So let's look at, um, we don't have, we haven't been in this class following a story, following history. We just sort of in the crash course, the 4 weeks, we kind of zoomed through all of American history. Um, Last week we talked about the Little Rock Nine. Um, in the 1950s, was that 1957, I think. The story of desegregation in American high schools. And so the study of history is often looking at one little thing that represents a bigger thing, right? In across the whole country. That was happening in high schools across the whole country, but we looked at one little story. Um, so what we'll do today is just something that I find really interesting. Actually, what we did was I first taught this over the summer. I was doing social studies class every week, and somebody asked me, well, can we learn, the cause of the Civil War? Okay, and this lesson here, we're not going to get through the whole thing today. I have a couple of different parts to it. Um, but I'll send this out to you. We'll get through, maybe half of it or something, and then I'll send this to you, and you can look it over, you can read it um, over the next couple of weeks because we won't have class next week or the week after because it's Christmas Eve and then New Year's Eve. So we're not going to have this class on Thursdays. I will next do a Thursday class 3 weeks from now. I think it's um, let me look on the calendar. What would it be? January 7th. Okay. So we'll talk about that at the end too. Um, so what we're going to do is look at the causes of the Civil War. Okay. What does anybody remember the years of the American Civil War? Or take a guess. When was it? When do you think? What century was it? Was it the 1800s, 1900s, 1700s? When was it?
1800.
Yeah, Civil War, the American Civil War happens in the 1800s. Okay, 1860 to 1861 to 1864. Okay, 1861 to 1864. Now, of course, you have the Declaration of Independence, 1776. So this is about 80, 90 years after. No, yeah, it's like 80, 85, 90 years after the country started. Okay. Um, so we are we're less than 100 years into America after the Revolutionary War. So it's a young country. Who is in 1860? Who is elected president and then is the president through the Civil War? Who's the famous president through the Civil War? Oh, Guisha, I couldn't quite hear you. Who is the president?
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln in 1860 is elected president. And then, of course, the southern states secede, right? They say we are our own country now. And they fight the Civil War. So we're not talking about the Civil War today. We're talking about the couple of decades, a long time that leads up to the moment when those southern states say, nope, we're done, we're out of here, we don't want to be a part of this country anymore. Okay, didn't happen overnight. It happens very slowly to get to that point. So we're going to look at a couple of things. Now there's lots of things you could study, but I picked out just a few big things that lead to that moment, the causes, the long-term causes of the Civil War. So let's just look, okay? First thing we're going to talk about, if you look on the screen, the Senate passes what's called the Missouri Compromise. It's a compromise. We're going to talk about how is it a compromise, who was compromising, that makes, look at this map. You have the pink is states, the dirty yellow color is territories. Okay, so the states just don't come up overnight. Generally, new land, and we've talked about this with Manifest Destiny, westward expansion, that new land becomes a territory, and then it later becomes a state. Okay, so the Missouri Territory gets turned into some states. So we're going to look at that. The Senate passes the Missouri Compromise. That's in 1820. So that's a long time, 40 years before the Civil War, but it's something that leads into, it's a cause of the Civil War. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so we'll read that. We'll look at a couple of maps. Then we'll study something called Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s. Again, it's a discussion of territories becoming states. We're going to talk about that. Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s. And then, so we're going to, the three branches of government. We got the legislative branch and Senate, and the Senate and House of Representatives are very influential in bringing in those new states. But here we're going to look at the Supreme Court. I don't think we'll get to this today, but the Supreme Court rules in the Dred Scott case, a famous Supreme Court case. We'll check that out. I think that's the third thing. So this is, and then there's a couple more maps. Okay. And it's good to prepare for that GED test, the high set test. You got to be comfortable looking at maps and saying, okay, what information is this map telling me? And then of course there's always a question that goes with it. So you got to be prepared to make sense of a map, or maybe, often it's a graph or something, but you got to make sense of it and think, okay, here's the question. How do I find the answer using this thing they've given me? Okay, so we can take turns and just kind of talk as we go. I've highlighted yellow some what I think academic vocabulary words. Okay, let's look at the map real quick. First before we get going. The title, if there's a title, let's say down at the bottom, States and Territories of the United States of America, December 10th, 1817 to October 20th, 1818. This is from a series, I found this in a series of maps that show each and every tiny little change that America goes through. And, maybe if we have time sometime, I'll show it to you. But it shows with the colors and the shapes, the changing of land, who it belongs to. It changes to territories, and it changes to states, and everything. All the colors change and the shapes change. So this is really, let's say 1817, 1818. We have a lot of territory: Alabama territory, Missouri territory, Illinois territory, Michigan territory. Now, some of this should look familiar, right? These shapes we now recognize. This will become the state of Michigan. Down here at the bottom of Illinois territory is the shape of Illinois made by the Missouri River and the Ohio River. This Alabama territory, clearly, obviously, will become the state of Alabama. Okay, but we see a couple of, the bottom of Alabama, the bottom of Mississippi, and what we now know as Florida aren't states yet. They're not pink. They're not the light pink state color. Gray is other countries. Florida belonged to Spain in 1818. This is Spanish land. And pink is disputed areas. So, America probably said it belonged to us. Spain said it belonged to them. So it's disputed land. But you see the definite shapes of these territories turning into states down the road. Okay, so largely UEC. The first couple of things here are just, we're not talking about slavery, right? I haven't yet said slavery, although slavery is a big part of it. We're talking about states. How are states, the birth of a state, the turning from a territory into a state, how is that going to cause a civil war, right? Everybody should be happy with new states. The country is expanding, taking over new land. Everybody should be happy. So we're going to see, how does that cause a civil war that breaks the nation in half? Okay. All right. We can take turns reading here. Let me get us started. The Senate passes the Missouri Compromise, February 17th, 1820. The Senate passes the Missouri Compromise, an attempt to deal with the dangerously divisive issue of extending slavery into the Western territories. Okay, well, there we go. There's our answer. That's how the birth of a state becomes such a problem, right? Because it deals with the dangerously divisive issue of extending slavery into the Western territories. What does it mean, a divisive issue? Some people say divisive, some people you might pronounce it divisive. What does that mean? What's the root word of divisive?
I think it's division.
Yeah, division, divide. Okay. So a divisive issue is an issue, a topic that's going to divide the country in two. So the divisive issue, divisive issue of extending slavery into the Western territories. Here's how this causes a civil war 40 years later. In the Missouri Territory, the way that a territory becomes a state is, and Congress made all these rules and they had all this process, okay, and it's in the Constitution. A territory just means land belongs to the United States. And if you live there, you don't live in a state. If let's say you live out in the middle of the Missouri Territory, let's say Alabama, okay, right down here, the shape of Alabama is as we know it today. It's the same shape of Alabama, but it hadn't become a state yet, right? So it's territory. Mississippi is there, Tennessee, Georgia, all around it is states, but the middle is not a state. Alabama is not a state, it's just a territory. For Alabama to become a state, there were some rules, there were some things that Alabama had to do. First, you have to have, I think, a certain number of citizens living there. Now, in 1820, some people are citizens, some people are not citizens, right? Only white people, essentially, are citizens. So if there's slavery there, those slaves don't count as citizens. Women are citizens, but not, of course, not voting in 1820. So you have to have a certain number of citizens, which means, people have to live there. People have to move there and live there. There's a couple of rules, and then the state has to become a state, Alabama has to make a government, right? A state government, just like we have a state government in Harrisburg. Alabama has to come up with a state government, and they have to write a state constitution. Okay. When you do those things and you apply for statehood to Congress, then after a period of time, Congress can approve you as a state. Okay. Sounds good. Sounds boring, right? Nothing, it doesn't matter to us. Who cares when Alabama became a state? Except the question is the divisive issue of extending slavery into the Western territories. So we're going to, let's read on here and see, why is that so divisive? The question is, when Missouri Territory, this is a big piece of land, when it becomes a bunch of new states, are those states, those new states in that area, going to have slavery? Okay. Jendai, could you read this next paragraph from colonial days? Jendai, could you read that paragraph from colonial days?
Okay.
Are you there? Okay.
The Senate passed the Missouri Compromise and attempt to deal with the dangerously devised issue of extending slavery into the Western territories. From colonial days to the Civil War, slavery and Western expansion both played fundamental, um, but inherently incomplete roles in the American public. Now, as the nation expanded westward, the Congress adopted relatively liberal procedures by which Western territories could organize and join the Union and full-fledged states. Southern slaveholders, eager to replicate the plantation systems to the West, wanted to keep the new territories open to slavery. Abolitionists, what was it?
Abolitionists.
Abolitionists. Why did I do it? Abolitionists concentrated primarily in the industrial North, wanted the West to be exclusively a free labor region and hoped that slavery would gradually die out if confined to the South. Both fractions realized their future congressional influence would depend on the number of new slave and free states admitted into the Union.
Okay, thank you. So we see it is an important issue to everybody across the country. Will those new states, as they come up, as they pop up, will they be slave states or free states? Okay. If they allowed slavery, we would call them slave states. If they did not allow slavery, we call them free states. Largely abolitionists, and of course, abolitionists are people who wanted to abolish or end slavery. Abolitionists. Let's say they're largely in the North, although I'm sure you could find them everywhere across the country. But let's say largely the people in the North, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and certainly up into New England. A lot of abolitionists. There may be a little bit of slavery up there, but several of those states, many of those states had abolished slavery by law. Okay, where of course we have slavery in the South, growing cotton, tobacco, indigo. Okay, the classic Southern slave plantations. People in the South wanted those new states when they come to have slavery. People in the North wanted those new states when they pop up to not have slavery. Okay. That's why everybody cares. The people in the North, the abolitionists, were hoping that if those new states as they pop up could be free states, maybe that terrible thing of slavery would just kind of die out. Maybe it'd be in the South, and then, they weren't thinking, of course, they did not know a civil war was coming, right? So they said, well, if we can just kind of end slavery, just kind of, if the new states don't have slavery, maybe it'll just end. Maybe it won't be a big deal and people will just stop having slaves. That was their hope. Okay. Couple of good words here. Slavery and Western expansion both played fundamental but inherently incompatible roles in the American Republic. When things are incompatible, that means they don't work well together, right? Incompatible is a good word. And it says, as the nation expanded westward, Congress adopted relatively liberal procedures by which Western territories could organize and join the Union as full-fledged states. So liberal procedures means very free, in this case, if a procedure is liberal, it means very easy to do, very allowing. It's easy for those new states, the territories to become states. Okay. Olawakimi, could you read the next paragraph, consequently?
Can you let the next person read? I have some little background noise. So,
Okay.
Yeah, by the time she finished, then I'll be done.
Okay. Okay. Don't worry about it. Guisha, could you read that paragraph? Consequently.
Okay. Consequently, the West became the first political battleground over the slavery issue. In 1818, the territory of Missouri applied to Congress for admission as a slave state. Early in 1819, a New York congressman introduced an amendment,
Amendment.
amendment amendment to the proposed Missouri Constitution that would ban importation of new slaves and require gradual em- emancipation of existing slaves. Southern congressmen reacted with outrage, inspiring of nationwide debate on the future of slavery in the nation.
Okay. Thank you. So we see the territory of Missouri in 1818 applies to Congress to become a state with slavery. So they applied to territory of Missouri wants to become the state of Missouri with slavery. So we see on the map now. This map is, we'll look at it more in a minute, but we see the red state of Missouri coming in as red slave states, blue free states. Okay. So since it's Congress's job to approve Missouri as a new state, every congressman across the country gets, Congress discusses the constitution of that new state, because really the states are joining a club, right? The union of the other states. So every other state, just like if we had a club and somebody new wants to come in to the club, we get to say if they're a good person, if they're the kind of person we want in our club, right? So this Missouri is coming in as a state to join the club of the United States of America. And so the other states get to say, hey, let's look over this new constitution of the state of Missouri. And so this congressman, somebody from New York, introduces an amendment to the Missouri Constitution and say, okay, well, they can be a slave state for now, but it would ban the importation of new slaves. So you could have your slaves in Missouri, but you can't bring in new slaves. And it would require the gradual emancipation of existing slaves. So they said, okay, Missouri, you can be a slave state, but we're going to slowly eliminate slavery in the state of Missouri. Well, it says Southern congressman reacted with outrage, inspiring a nationwide debate. Okay, now we have, which brings us to the Missouri Compromise. What does it mean when you compromise? If you and I are arguing and we compromise, what does that mean?
Mm, It's a kind
You
of
agree to the other party.
agree.
Yeah, we agree to meet in the middle. We do kind of, partly what you want, partly what I want, right? If you and I are arguing about, let's say we're going out to dinner and you want to go to one place and I want to go to another place and we compromise, it means it could mean a lot of different things. Maybe it's we say, well, we're going to go to my restaurant today, but when we go next week, we'll go to your restaurant, right? Or it means let's pick a third restaurant that we both can agree on, right? So neither of us get everything we want, but we both get something we want, right? We compromise. Well, some of the best things in American history are compromises, and there's a bunch of compromises in the Constitution. Remember, we talked about how we came up with what we call now a bicameral legislature. The big states with lots of people wanted Congress to be represented by population. The little states with few people wanted Congress to be represented equally. The compromise was that they came up with the two houses of Congress. right? The Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate, every state has 2 senators. The House of Representatives is represented by population. So that's a compromise. Here's another compromise. So this next paragraph is going to talk about the Missouri Compromise. Let me read this. It says, over the next year, the congressional debate grew increasingly bitter, and Southerners began to threaten secession and civil war. So here we are in 1820, 40 years before the Civil War, and they're talking about secession and civil war. They're saying, well, if we don't get our way, we're leaving. It says, to avoid this disastrous possibility, key congressmen hammered together an agreement that became known as the Missouri Compromise. In exchange for admitting Missouri without restrictions on slavery, so Missouri becomes a slave state, no restrictions, have all the slavery you want. The compromise called for bringing in Maine as a free state. The compromise also dictated that slavery would be prohibited in all future western states carved out of the Louisiana Territory and that were higher in latitude than the northern border of Arkansas Territory. Here's what that means. Missouri comes in slave state. Okay, Missouri, you want to have slavery? Have slavery. But we're also at the same time going to bring in Maine, way up north. Maine had not been a state. Okay, let's look at the other map. Maine up here was technically part of Massachusetts, right? The state of Massachusetts with the little hook, the Cape Cod, Boston, Massachusetts. The other part of Massachusetts, even though they don't touch, was the land of Maine. Now they say, let's turn Maine into its own state, and it's going to be a free state. So we get one slave state, one free state. The reason is they wanted to keep, it's all about keeping the balance in the Senate, right? In the Senate, where everybody's equal, 2 senators per state, they wanted to keep a balance, equal slave senators and free senators. Okay. It's all about keeping the numbers equal in the Senate. They do sense a war might come someday, and so they're trying to fight off that possibility. So they say, okay, Missouri, free slave state, Maine, free state. We'll keep it equal. One slave, one free. But of this new territory, the Missouri Territory, which was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Okay, no slavery. That territory will be. I mean, they knew it'll become states at some point, probably very soon for them. Any territory that becomes states out of that land above the northern line, the northern border here on this map, it's a nice black line. If it's north, if the new state comes and it's north of that line, it's a free state. If it's south of that line, it can choose to be a slave state. Okay. So they're compromising. I mean, abolitionists wanted to end slavery and slaveholders wanted to keep slavery, but they're saying, okay, let's do one slave state, one free state, and out of the new territory will become new states. Let's draw a line, and north of that will be free and south of that will be slave. Okay, so it's a compromise. It keeps slavery. Slavery is going to continue to exist, but with some limitations, so the abolitionists could be a little bit happy. Okay. And it says, so here's our conclusion of this section. Although the Missouri Compromise temporarily eased the inherent tensions between Western expansion and slavery, the divisive issue was far from resolved. Whether or not to allow slavery in the states of Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska, which are, coming down the road, whether or not to allow slavery in the states of Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska caused the same difficulties several decades later, leading the nation towards civil war. Okay, so if we're talking about the causes of the Civil War, the long-term early causes of the Civil War, you can start that conversation with the Missouri Compromise. As all this land out west, all this territory was going to become states, the question is, are those states going to have slavery or not have slavery? Are they going to be slave states or free states? Okay. And in the Missouri Compromise, this is what they came up with. Okay. Not perfect. It kind of buys them some time. It doesn't really answer the question. It doesn't solve the problem. It kind of, the saying is they kick the can down the road. They're still going to have to deal with this, but for the time being, they had a plan. Okay. Any questions on the Missouri Compromise? Does it make sense what they did? Okay. Now, the same story goes on. Now we're 30 years later. We're now in the 1850s. We'll talk about this and then we'll be done. We're not going to get to the Dred Scott Supreme Court case. Now we have Kansas. Okay, now let's look at our map. We have the states of Missouri, Arkansas, Texas. Okay, these are all green. Now we don't have the key to this map or the legend. We can't see what the colors mean, but here's what the colors mean. Green is slave states, purple is free states, and the red or pink is territories. Okay. So now we get to something called Bleeding Kansas. Now, without knowing anything about this, if they call it Bleeding Kansas, what does that tell us about this situation?
It involves blood.
Yeah, it's going to involve blood. It's going to involve violence. Okay. Now, this is a very interesting part of American history. And when I look at, the news today, everybody knows we're so divided, right, between Democrats and Republicans and people that view things very differently. And people think, oh, people say, oh, we're going to have another civil war because we're so divided and the country's so crazy. I look to this. I look to the 1850s and what the country was like and how you want to talk about divided and people hating each other. Let's read here and why they called it Bleeding Kansas. And then we'll know exactly how what a divided nation looks like. Okay, the 1850s was in my opinion, it was a bad time to be an American, especially out west. But even living where we live in Pennsylvania, reading the newspaper every day, every week about things happening out in Kansas, it must have been crazy. This is kind of crazy stuff. Okay, so let's read this. We'll get through this. It's not actually that long, so we'll get through this. We'll talk through it, and then I think we'll probably be done for the day. So, Bleeding Kansas. Jendaya, could you read the first paragraph? Jendaya, you there? Can you read the first paragraph for us? All right, maybe he stepped away. Guisha, could you read the first paragraph?
Okay. Bleeding Kansas is the term used to describe the period of violence during the settling of the Kansas territory. In 1854, Kansas Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise use of latitude as the boundary between slaves and free territory, and instead using the principle of popular slavery, sovereignty.
Mhm.
It described decreed that the resident would determine whether the area become a free state or a slave state. Pro-slavery and free state settler flooded into Kansas to try to influence the decision. Violence soon erupted as both factions fought for control. Abo- abolitonists- aboli- Abolitionists John
Mhm.
Brown, the anti-slavery fighter in Kansas before his famed Red of Harbor's Ferry.
Okay, thank you. So here we hear about the Missouri Compromise again. Okay, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, an act here is a law, right? A law passed by Congress in Washington, D.C. The Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise's use of latitude, that line, as the boundary between slave and free territory. Okay, so they said in the Missouri Compromise, any new state north of that line would be free. Any new state south of that line could have slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act threw out that rule. Instead, it said using the principle of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means that the people, the population, the people get to decide if that's new state, the people in that state decide if that state will be free or slave. Okay. Sounds good, right? Sounds fair. If Kansas, if the Kansas territory, and we see on the map the shape of Kansas territory, if Kansas territory is going through the process of becoming a state, then they have enough population, they have all the things that are required to apply for statehood. They're writing, they're making a state government, they have a state capital, they have a state constitution. They're going through the process. At some point, the people in the voters, the citizens in Kansas will vote, and they'll say, do we want this new state when it comes? Do we want to have slavery? Okay, that sounds good, right? That's a good thing. The people there should be the people to decide. You can say that's a good thing. But here's what happens when you do that. It says pro-slavery. Pro means you support something. So pro-slavery and free state settlers, people for slavery and against slavery, flooded into Kansas to try to influence the decision. Okay, so what they said is next year we're going to have an election, and in that election we're going to vote on this question: will Kansas have slavery or not? And so they said, well, okay, so next year we're going to do that. In that year, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from really all over other states, okay, to the west was Missouri, or to the east is Missouri, of Texas, Arkansas, surrounding areas, even people from Pennsylvania, other states, moved to live in Kansas, moved to Kansas because they wanted to be there on that day. They wanted to live in Kansas on the day that they voted if Kansas was going to be slave or free. Okay. So, and I think that's really interesting. So they said, okay, we're going to let the people in Kansas to decide next year, on election day, whatever we do. And in the meantime, people said, oh, I want to be there. So they moved to Kansas to live there. And of course, these are people who feel very strongly either to support slavery or against slavery. So you have some really angry people who feel very strongly for or against slavery. Well, when you have thousands of people
Determine
crushing over each other who are, feel very strongly about something, well, something's going to happen here. Okay. Next paragraph, said to have been coined. Jendai, could you read that paragraph? Said to have been coined.
Said to have, no, said to, okay, here we go. Said to have been coined by Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. The label Bleeding Kansas was first fixed on that strife-ridden territory by anti-slavery publicists. The opening of the Kansas and Nebraska territories in 1854 under the principle of popular sovereignty provoked a protracted political crisis in both Kansas and the nation at large. Rival governments had been established in Kansas by late 1855. One backed by pro-slavery Missourians, the other by anti-slavery groups.
Okay, so it says, thank you. So it says a protracted political crisis. When a protracted crisis means that like an ongoing, long term. Okay, so if I have a protracted problem in my house, it's a long term problem. Okay, so it provokes the opening of Kansas and Nebraska territories in 1854 under the principle of popular sovereignty provoked a protracted political crisis. People were coming, like I said, coming into the states in Kansas and Nebraska. Let's look at the map. Kansas and Nebraska. Okay. And in Kansas, it gets crazy. Rival governments, it says, had been established in Kansas by late 1855. There were 2 state governments in Kansas. They had 2 state capitals, both of which said, no, we're the right state capital. We're the true government. They had 2 sets of state governments in Kansas by 1855, with like passing laws and writing constitutions and everything. That's crazy. That's really crazy. One being a pro-slavery, one anti-slavery. People, one free government, one slave government, both of which said they are the right one. They're the true government. They're writing a state constitution for the state of Kansas, and they're saying this is the real constitution. Okay, that's crazy. That's a problem. That's a real problem if you're living in Kansas, or if you're living in Pennsylvania and reading your newspaper and saying, oh boy, this Kansas thing is a real mess. All right, let me read here. Although the Pierce and Buchanan administrations, these presidents, Pierce and Buchanan during that time, although the Pierce and Buchanan administrations recognized the former, Republicans, as well as a number of Northern Democrats, deemed it a fraud imposed by Missouri border ruffians. Okay. So they were really, the president recognized the pro-slavery government, but Northern Democrats deemed it a fraud imposed by Missouri border ruffians, people who would cross, let's look at the map, people who would cross the border from Missouri into Kansas to be violent, cause trouble, have riots, basically terrorism a little bit, murder people. Border ruffians were people from Missouri who would cross the border into Kansas. Okay. It says civil conflict in Kansas accompanied the political polarization. Polarization is, of course, people being at 2 ends. You have the North Pole, South Pole, that sort of thing. People being at 2 ends of the political ideas. Civil conflict. The volatility to be expected of a frontier area was compounded by the activities of parties interested in the slavery issue. Both the Missourians and the Northerners who were reputedly shipped free state settlers and armaments to the region. So not only are people coming, but armaments, weapons, are being shipped into the region. So this is getting real dangerous real fast. Okay, you have 2 separate state governments who both say they are the correct one. People are getting angry and they're armed, and something's gonna happen. Hostilities between armed bands seemed imminent in late 1855, as well as over 1,000 Missourians crossed the border and menaced the town of Lawrence, a free state stronghold. So pro-slavery people from Missouri are threatening the town of Lawrence, which is a free state town. And on May 21st, 1856, ruffians actually looted the town of Lawrence, Kansas. In response, John Brown, who's at the time, a famous abolitionist, wasn't a politician, but he was an abolitionist. Because pro-slavery people looted the town of Lawrence, Kansas, John Brown orchestrated the murder several days later of 5 pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek. Actually, he killed them. John Brown, a couple of his sons, I think about a half a dozen men, broke into some houses at night and killed them with swords. Okay, they weren't shot with guns. They actually hacked them to bits, really, with swords. So this is a massacre. They call this the Pottawatomie Massacre. They didn't kill 100 people, but they killed 5. But they killed those people in their homes because of this tension, this crazy time. It says 4 months of partisan violence and depredation ensued, a lot of violence. Small armies ranged over eastern Kansas, clashing at Blackjack, these are towns, Franklin, Fort Sonder, Hickory Point, Slough Creek, and Osawatomie, where Brown and 40 others were routed in late August. So John Brown was very active. Says small armies. I mean, they kind of formed these pro-slavery, anti-slavery groups. You could call them militias, really. These small armies just fighting battles across Kansas in the 1850s. John W. Geary, appointed territorial governor in September, that'd be a hard job, managed to cool the border war with the aid of federal troops. So get in the United States Army and shut this stuff down. But Kansas had hardly ceased bleeding, as became apparent in 1858 when the Marais de Cygnes massacre of 5 Free State men and pronounced disorder in several counties. So you have more violence, 1858. Murders, more violence across several counties. Although Kansas in that year, once and for all, rejected the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, such violence continued on a smaller scale into 1861. So 1861 is the beginning of the Civil War. So we're talking late 1850s. This is a few years before the Civil War. Kansas is just very violent. You have these 2 side-by-side governments in the state of Kansas, one for slavery, one against slavery. They finally, it says, once and for all, rejected the pro-slavery what they called the Lecompton Constitution, the state constitution. It was written by, I think it was written in the town of Lecompton, so that's what they called it. So Kansas becomes a free state in 1858, but after a lot of bloodshed over about 5 years or so. Okay, so 1850s, you have bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas because the new territories, Nebraska Territory, Kansas Territory, were going to be decided by popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is a good thing. People get to decide if that new state is going to have slavery. The people who live there should decide. That's great. But then you had everybody coming in to be a part of that and to influence the vote. And it got very violent very quickly for a very long time, several years. Okay. Next time, maybe after Christmas or, maybe we'll get to this, maybe we won't, but I will send this to you. I'll email this to you. I would encourage you to read this last part, the Supreme Court rules in Dred Scott case, 1857. So we're right a couple of years before the breakout of the Civil War. These are the things that cause the tension. Okay. It's not one thing that causes the Civil War. It's a long, Missouri Compromise was 1820, 41 years before the Civil War. It's a long road that gets us to the Civil War in 1861. Okay. I'll send this out. You can look this over. Any questions? This is kind of confusing stuff. A lot of back and forth. Any questions at all?
No.
No? Okay. I think it's interesting, you know, and again, we hear about how divided our nation is today, and that's true, but not like it was then. Not like it was in the 1850s. It was crazy. Again, in Kansas, it was so divided. You had two different state governments pop up who said that we are the real state government. You know, if you live in Kansas, who are you going to listen to? How are you going to know what's right and what's wrong? So it was a crazy time to live in. We will be in touch. You know, Lisa Bailey, the Distance Learning Project, will be in touch about starting classes up again after the holidays. But I plan to do a class. Let's look at the calendar here. I plan to do a class Thursday, January 7th. Okay. Next Thursday is Christmas Eve. The Thursday after that is New Year's Eve. So I won't do a class those days, but 3 weeks from now, January 7th, I will do a class at 11 o'clock. And I don't know exactly what that social studies class will look like. Again, we're going to talk about the social studies class, me and the other teachers. But, you know, I hope you guys have happy holidays. You know, we all got some snow last night, so hopefully you're okay. All
Before you
across
go, I
West
just
Virginia.
want to say for those of you who do not know, I'll be taking my writing exam this upcoming Wednesday.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, good luck. Good luck with the writing exam. Let me write that down.
Yes, and I'm planning on graduating. I'm going to be graduating next year.
Yeah. Okay.
Graduating from high school. Now, usually most people and young people when they graduate from high school, they are 17 and 18. But I'm homeschooled. I had some issues, so I'm graduating from high school at age 21. I'm 21,
Okay.
so I'll be graduating next year,
Hmm.
next spring.
Yeah, well, definitely good luck with the test then next Wednesday. So that's exciting. So that'll be a good Christmas present to give to yourself is pass that test. That'll be nice.
That would be wonderful. That's what I was going to say. That I was just about
Yeah.
to say that.
Yeah, totally. So okay. Well,
Well,
thank you guys for logging in.
have a good day.
Yeah. Have a good
All
day. I'll
right,
send out an
bye.
email and yeah, have a happy holidays, everybody.
Thank
Merry
happy holiday.
Christmas and Happy New Year in advance.
Yeah. I'll see you in 2021 then.
Okay.
See you in 2021.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Yes, sir.
Bye.
Bye.